Hi, welcome back. Let's go ahead and just take a moment to center ourselves and fully arrive. So go ahead and find a comfortable position. Close your eyes. And just start by taking a few deep breaths. Just noticing anything you might be feeling in your body. Using your breath to bring in a little compassion. And a little release with each exhale. Just using that breath to open up a nice, wide open space inside yourself. With each exhale, just releasing any thoughts or images that may have come up for you inside that space. Just letting them slide to the side. With each inhale, opening that space up a little broader. With each exhale, releasing anything that might have entered into it. Maybe noticing the muscles in your face, using your exhale to release those. Using your exhale to release the muscles in your shoulders. Your chest or belly, back, arms, legs. And while we're orienting ourselves and our bodies, just take a moment to try to orient ourselves in space also. See if you can get a visual of where the cardinal directions are situated around you. You imagine yourself on a map, and think of where's the north and where's the south. If you know where the sun rises or sets, you can orient yourself east and west. Just arriving in your place, in your body, open and ready. And opening your eyes, giving your body a little stretch, a little attention, wherever it might need it. All right, let's jump on in to looking at how we can delineate chart types. These first couple slides come from Veronato's Good Charts, and he gives a really nice delineation of when to use different types of charts. And so take a second to look here and orient yourself in this. You can just start in the middle there. It says, what would you like to show? Is it a relationship, a comparison, a distribution, or a composition? And then each of those 4 categories can be broken down. And there is some overlap between the categories also. But as you can see, if you look at the relationship, when you've got 2 variables, you can use the scatter plot, or if you've got 3 variables, you can change the size of those points that are plotted on that chart to show those also, as we've seen in some of the videos examples with population size and such. For comparison, they break it down into two categories: among items or over time. Are we comparing different things, or are we looking across time? And so when we're comparing items, we're either looking at one variable per item or two variables per item. And so in the two variables, he's changed the width of the bar chart to show that other variable. I don't know if that would be my favorite way. I don't see those too often. So it might be a little confusing for people if they see that. Some other illustrations he has from the one variable per item is to use a table with embedded charts to show comparisons across different charts, to show two horizontal bar charts next to each other, or just a simple vertical bar chart also. If we're looking over time, cyclical data can be shown in a circular chart, where the loop around is going to be the time. Like you could label each of those little radial lines coming out as a month. You could show temperature per year on a chart like that. If it's non-cyclical, you can just do a timeline and show as the value varies across time. You could also do a bar chart or a multiple line chart if you're showing a number of different categories. We'll see examples of all these as we cruise through here. For a distribution, it's also a matter of how many variables you've got. Here again, you can use the scatter plot. You can also use the histogram, the line histogram or the bar histogram, showing how the distribution occurs. Composition is where you're going to get into the stacked bar charts and the stacked area charts, where you really want to show how you've got a main quantity, like say a budget or something, and you want to show how much of your budget is allocated to these different areas, maybe over time. That might be good for a stacked area chart or a stacked bar chart. You could do that by month that way also. And then on the static composition side, you could use a pie chart, waterfall chart, stacked bar chart with subcomponents. So where you're like zooming in on a part of, you start with one bar chart and then you zoom in on a part of it and expand that, and zoom in on a part of that and expand that. And then there's also a tree map option. And you'll find that you're naturally drawn to some of these more than others, that some make sense to you more intuitively than others do, and so you can pick and choose among them. But this is one way to start when you start sorting, looking for data and sorting through data and figuring out which data you want to use. Then you can start thinking about what chart you want to use. Okay, so here Veronato gives us some good keywords to look for when you're trying to decide, okay, I'm not sure what relationship I'm trying to show, and so I don't know what chart to show. And so here we've got, for comparisons, if you're using the words before and after, categories, compare, contrast, over time, peaks, rank, trend, types, valleys. All of these words are going to show up when you're talking about comparisons. Keywords for distributions are going to be alluvial, cluster, distributed, from and to, plotted, points, spread, spread over, relative to, or transfer. Compositions keywords are going to be components, divvied up, group, makes up of the whole, parts, percentage, pieces, portion, proportion, slices, subsections, total. Maps or logic networks are going to be cluster, complex, connections, group, hierarchy, if-then, organize, network, paths, places, relationships, routes, structure, space, yes or no. You can see some of the examples down there for those types of charts. So this is a great place to refer back to in the Good Charts book, page 83 and 85, when you're kind of swimming in data and not sure what kind of chart to use for that. Kind of helps you do more than just shooting in the dark for your chart. Now that you have an overview of the system, we're ready for a little more detail. And so that's just to say, yep, that's a lot of information right there. And without really applying it, it may not make much sense to you. That's what we're going to get into next. But one more little funny here. Check this one out for a second. Pop quiz. What kind of a chart is this? Is it a comparison, a distribution, a composition, or a relationship? If you said composition, you are right. You could also say it's a comparison, right? It's comparing like how much these parts are with respect to one another. But basically it's showing the composition of the circle. How much of the circle is sky? How much of it is the sunny side of the pyramid? How much is the shady side of the pyramid? All right, that's just a quick funny. Now let's get into types of infographics via wealth distribution. So we're going to use this one topic and look how this one topic is displayed across a number of different charts. And you can kind of get an idea of the pros and cons of each of those different kinds of charts. We're going to look at a pie chart, a map, a bar graph, a line graph. And so the line graph is going to show us comparisons over time. The bar graph is also going to show us comparisons. The map is going to show us distribution. And the pie chart is going to show us composition. So first with the pie chart. So 80% of Americans share only 7% of all the money in America. So we can look here at that black section. The top 1% owns 43% of the financial wealth. The next 4% owns 29% of the wealth. The next 15% owns 21%. And 7% of the wealth is owned by 80% of Americans. And so that's a confusing one, right? Because there's two different percentages to keep track of. So what the pie graph is showing you is the percentage of wealth, but it's not showing you the percentages of people who own that wealth, right? And so this one might be a little confusing to show that specific relationship. This is a really tricky relationship to show. So let's see it. Look at a couple different ways to look at that. Here's one that does wealth distribution around the world. And so it's a map. It's showing a distribution on a map. And we can see over here by the key, we have income level distribution. But we do not know what those values mean. Not so obviously anyhow, unless we read the fine print here. It says values are based on the Gini coefficient, a measure of dispersion for each country. It's a calculation that represents the relative mean difference of personal income between citizens. So it's like a disparity of wealth. Values are multiplied by 100 to generate whole numbers, where a value of 1 is absolute equality, where everybody makes the same amount of money, and 100 is absolute inequality. It'd be nice if they gave you an example of that. Does that mean one person owns everything and then the rest of the people own nothing? I guess that's probably about what it is. So in general, higher numbers, darker color, greater disparity of wealth. Fewer people own more stuff. More people own less stuff and greater disparity of wealth. Okay, so United States, you might start with a baseline is 36 to 45. It's like, oh, that doesn't look too bad. It's not so far down on the scale there. But if you compare it with Europe, most of Europe is 25 to 35, along with Australia and a couple countries in Africa and over in the east as well. And so we're not on the far end. It might surprise you to see which countries are on the far end over there. But this kind of just gives you an idea. This is a good chart to use for the map because it's not telling you anything about the numbers of people in each of those countries. And so that's the way that maps can sometimes be misleading, is because you can tend to think land mass equals number of people, and you can think, oh, it looks like most of the world is in the 36 to 45 category. But that's not showing you numbers of people. It's just showing you land mass. Like there's not that many people that are going to live up in the northern regions of Russia, for example. Okay, let's look at another example of a way to illustrate this tricky concept of wealth distribution. So the distribution of financial wealth in the United States. So here they're really trying to show the comparison between the amount of people and the amount of money, right? So it becomes a little bit more obvious. One person standing on a huge stack of money, a few people standing on a slightly smaller stack. The more crowded the people get, the smaller the stacks get. And so they're showing this in two different ways. They've showed it by a combined bar graph, and they're also showing it on a map specifically to compare. It says if U.S. land was divided like U.S. wealth, and one person would have 43% of the country. The next would have about 40%, and the bottom 90% would have about 27% of the country. And so you can see that crowdedness starts to convey a little bit more. I think I personally like the combo bar chart better than the map chart because it's bringing in land area, which land is a measure of wealth, but if we're just measuring wealth specifically, I like the stacks of money specifically for conveying that information. The land area is a little difficult to determine percentages also because it's an irregular shape. I really had to look at the fine print to determine what those percentages were. I couldn't really tell just from looking at the map, so it was also less explicit in that way. All right, here's one over time. So the change in median household income by income group over 45 years. And it's nice that it includes that all values are in 2012 values. So inflation has been accounted for. And what we see is the highest earners, the red line there, their wealth has continued to grow since 1967-70 all the way to 2012. Their income has grown the most, whereas people in the $100,000 range has also grown, whereas pretty much everyone, $60,000 had a little bit of increase from 60,000 to almost 90,000, but everybody else has stayed pretty darn flat in their level of financial growth across those years. And this might be a slightly inaccurate representation also, because I'm looking at the 9,000 to 12,000, that lowermost line there. 9,000 to 12,000, it's increased by a third, by $3,000 basically. Whereas 100,000 to 189,000, it's almost doubled. So instead of increasing by a third, it's increased by a whole. And the 168 to 320 is about the same. That's about doubled. So the top two have about doubled, and the bottom ones are just increasing by a percentage. So this one, I really like this graph also because it shows the over time growth and how wealth has been distributed. All right, so we looked at 4 different chart types. We looked at the pie graph, we looked at a map distribution, we looked at a combo bar graph, and then we've looked at this line graph. And you can see how that one core concept has been illustrated in a number of different ways. All right, let's look at some other graph types, moving on to networks. So networks show us how things are connected. I really like to use astrological connections for this one. Here we see the trines in between the constellations are illustrated in a circle. The ecliptic, the sun moves through all those constellations. And you can see that the element of the signs is in a triangle. So Aries, Sagittarius, and Leo are in a triangle with respect to one another. Those are all the fire signs. And if you look at that circle on the far right, you can see the blue triangle is the water, red triangle is fire, green triangle is earth, and yellow triangle is air. And so if you're not an astrologer, you maybe never would have thought about how the geometrical relationships between the astrological signs relate to their elements, but they do. And as you can see in the middle there aren't just triangles, but there are also some green squares included. And at the next slide, you can see how the squares illustrate the qualities of the signs, whether they're cardinal, starting things off, starting a season off specifically, fixed, being that stalwart middle of the season, or immutable, changing to the next season. And so you can see Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn are all cardinal signs. They're all starting off a season, and then the fixed signs and the mutable signs, and they're in that square relationship to each other. And so the network graph is showing how those qualities relate to one another. And I've also included a matrix here, and you can see in the columns you've got the elements, fire, earth, air, and water. And then in the rows we have the qualities, cardinal, fixed, and mutable. And that's another way that you can show this geometrical relationship that can be showed as a network on the circle or in a grid format. Another thing that's cool to look at in network format are musical notes. You can see the red lines here are the jumps in fifths. The whole tones are illustrated by the orange lines, and you can, if you trace those around, you can see they all skip a note on this circle. The minor thirds, diminished, are the yellow lines, and you can see they skip 2 notes before getting to their next note in their family. And the major thirds augmented are the green ones. They're skipping 3 notes. The chromatic notes are skipping 4 notes, and the tritones are skipping exactly halfway across the circle. Another way you can look at network maps is to show, like if you imagine in these network maps, each of those little points around the edge of the circle is a person, and the lines show who's friends in that circle, who are the allies, who knows each other, who communicates with each other. And this image is showing the principle of small world networks. So if you look at that very bottom circle, people are only connected to the people in proximity to them. There's no random connections across the circle. And as the circles move up, you're getting more and more random connections. So lower clustering, higher connectivity. The small world networks rule is that gradually replacing local connections with random connections quickly increases the connectivity of a network. You only have to have a few random connections that are outside your little group in order to quickly increase the connectivity of the entire group of people. All right, on to matrices. So matrices are just grid charts, but it might be one where the whole grid is filled in to illustrate a principle rather than it just being a bar graph or a line graph. And so here we can see 2019's moon calendar, and it's showing you the phase of the moon for each day of each month of the year. It can be a nice way to visualize a large amount of information. Here's another example of matrices for photography using aperture, so how wide is the lens open, shutter speed, how fast are you taking it. If you're photographing sports, obviously you want it to be going much faster so you don't get a blurry image, and they've showed that really nicely with the blurring of the images for the slower shutter speed. And then the ISO is like what level of detail are you looking for, and they've showed that really nicely there with the pixelating or fuzziness of the image that increases as the ISO increases. It's getting more sensitive. In the aperture, you can see also the effect of the opening of the aperture on the blurring of the background image. And so it's going to be greater sensitivity to light, which is going to also change how things show up. Here's another example. It's also kind of like a bar graph, but it's a compilation of bar graphs. So it's a composition and a comparison. And it's looking at who participates online. And it's got it broken up by generations. You can see across the top there, young teens, youth, Gen Y, Gen X, young boomers, older boomers, and seniors. And it's saying, what are they doing? And it's got those rows broken up to creators, critics, collectors, joiners, spectators, or inactives. And it's breaking down the percentages within each of those categories. And so if you look at the seniors column, it's most obvious that 70% of seniors are inactives. They're online, but they're not really participating. 70% of them. 20% of them are spectators, 6% are joiners, 11% are collectors, 11% are critics, and 5% are creators. And you can kind of look how those shift and change. The youth tend to be more joiners. The young teens tend to be more creators. The critics tend to come a little bit more from the youth and Gen Y. The tricky thing about this graph is that neither the columns nor the rows add up to 100%. So you're kind of left wondering, what is this a percentage of? And granted, there might be some overlap. This is kind of how I'm interpreting it between the different ways of participating. So somebody might be both a critic and a creator, which is why the column for a generation might not add up to 100 because there might be some overlap between those. But it's not obvious from this display of the information that that's what's being communicated. Maybe a stacked area graph with some overlap might show where that overlap occurs and be a little more clear in that respect. So it's another example of how a matrices can be used to compare data. All right, this next one is really a mathematical relationship that can help with illustrating anything that abides by a power law, anything that shows relationships across scale. So you can see here on this graph, it's going from a mouse and small birds all the way up to an elephant. So that's what we mean by across scale, across a range of sizes, from the very small to the very large, whether it's time frames or sizes or mass or distances. Anything that's going from very small to very large is typically crossing scales and might benefit from a logarithmic graph. So what logarithms do is they make the exponential linear. So if you look at the y-axis on this graph, it's talking about metabolic rate. So how much energy are each of these animals using? And it's going from 0.1 to 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000. And so this is an example of an exponential scale. Each tick mark isn't going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going by multiples of 10. And so that's an exponential scale. But the multiples of 10 are represented as just one jump in tick marks. And so that's why it's called a logarithmic scale. If you look over here on the right, you can see 10 to the 0 is 1, 10 to the 1 is 10, 10 to the 2 is 100, 10 to the third is 1,000. So for each exponent, that exponent's basically telling you how many zeros are you putting after the 1. So logarithms kind of just turn the exponents inside out. So you can take a logarithm of a very large number and get a small number in a linear sequence. And so if we start at the bottom there, the logarithm of 1,000 is 3. And so it's just giving us what was that exponential value. So 10 to the third is 1,000, where 3 as an exponent is telling us there's going to be 3 zeros after that number. So you take the logarithm of 1,000, and it's just going to tell us again, how many zeros are there? There's 3. Okay, so it's taken 1,000, a really large number, and made it into a small number, 3, a linear number. And so it's going to have the third place in line there. Logarithm of 100 is 2, logarithm of 10 is 1, and logarithm of 1 is 0. And so you can see how it's taken those exponential jumps and made them into a linear line. And that's exactly what this graph has done. And you can play with that in Excel and Google Charts also. They do have a logarithm function, and it will change the shape of the chart. So play with that a little bit and see what it does if you have any data that's going across scales. What this graph is actually showing us is Kleebler's law, where the larger an animal is, the more efficiently it uses energy. So pretty much all animals get like the same number of heartbeats per lifetime, but the larger ones beat slower, and so they tend to live longer. This is metabolic rate specifically, but there are a lot of different characteristics of animals that scale similarly, that show up as, on a logarithmic graph, as a straight line. And because this line goes not quite up, right up, if it went straight up to the corner, it would be a linear relationship. But because the line falls slightly below that corner, it's a sublinear relationship. So it's getting more efficient. As animals get larger, they use energy more efficiently. Here's another way to look at the same thing. It's actually a 3/4 scaling law, so that body mass to the 3/4 exponent, the slope of the line is 3/4. Here it's a little less obvious that the line doesn't go all the way up to the corner. And they may have actually drawn it so that it does. But using the images of the animals brings those present a little bit more. And here he's calling it the economy of largeness, where a whale requires only about 3,000 times more energy than a mouse, even though it has roughly 10,000 times more body mass than that same mouse. So the slope of a logarithmic graph, which is the rise over run, so how many tick marks does it go up for however many tick marks does it go over, that's going to give you the slope of the line, which basically is just saying how steep is that line. A linear line will be at a 45-degree angle, and that will be an exponent of 1. Anything that's less than 1, a fractional exponent, is going to be sublinear. It's going to be below that 45-degree angle. Anything superlinear is going to be a very steep line above the 45-degree angle. And a superlinear exponent is anything with an exponent above 1. So this is kind of a clue that you're dealing with a power law if the mathematical relationship you're trying to illustrate has an exponent in it. Often that will be illustrated best on a logarithmic scale. If you're not using a logarithmic scale to illustrate an exponential law, what you're going to end up with is an asymptotic line. So a line that starts out slow and then gets really steep really fast. And using a logarithmic scale flattens that scale out so that the things that are very low on the scale are far away, or that are very high on the scale and are very far away, actually can be brought into the same realm of experience on the same graph. So an example of some other properties that scale as power laws are heart rate, I mentioned that one, brain size, respiration rate, lifespan, I mentioned lifespan also. And so these can all be understood mathematically as proportional to the size of an organism in a very specific relationship. Okay, so maps are going to show us where something occurs. So this one is talking about how our brains may be uniquely sensitive to pitch, the harmonic sounds we hear when listening to speech or music. And so they're showing that these different pitches, which they've color-coded, are showing up in very specific regions of the brain. And so that's what maps can show us, is where something shows up. Here's another map that's showing which counties flipped from Democrat to Republican in 2012 to 2016. And that can kind of give you an idea of where certain cultural shifts are happening. Here's a map that shows when different countries gave women the right to vote. They've color-coded the map from light-colored to show, hey, Australia and New Zealand were some of the first countries to give women the vote, along with some of the Scandinavian countries up here, whereas the Middle East were some of the later countries to give women the vote. This map isn't showing a geographic map, but it's showing how dividing things up makes a difference. This is talking about gerrymandering. Because what's happened basically is that places have started redistricting. They're splitting up majority Democrat. Typically it's a tactic used by Republicans, so I will go ahead and use those terms. That they're finding districts that are majority Democrat and dividing those districts up so that they're taking a small like a third of the Democrats from the majority Democrat district and mixing them in with a mostly Republican district. So breaking up the Democratic districts in order to wash out the Democratic votes, basically. And so, as you can see here, in a perfect representation, everybody's vote gets counted, right? Because each of the districts is solidly for whichever side they're for. And the number 2, it's compact, but it's unfair. So it's still going by natural divisions, but it's not fair because blue wins every district, 5 districts, and red wins none, even though they are actually representing 40% of the vote. In gerrymandering, it's neither compact or fair, so the districts start to get very spread out and convoluted, and it ends up so that the minority of the vote, so in here, the red, which is 40%, actually wins over the 60% blue because they've divided most of the blue into 2 winning districts and then the rest of the blue into 3 red districts that red wins. And so it's a very tricky tactic, obviously, and a tricky thing to show, but this infographic has showed it very nice and clearly in a way that's understandable, much more so than trying to look at an actual map. This next one, The World is 100 People, is a bit confusing. This might actually go in the bad infographics category because they've divided into so many categories. We've got, if we start over here on the left, we've got housing, and it says 23 have no shelter and 77 have shelter. But because you're just seeing that as a portion of the whole, it might have been better to do each of these in pie graphs themselves to show that they're individual wholes rather than trying to imagine each of these sections as adding up to a whole. So this might be an example of how not to do a composition graph, because it looks like, oh, there's housing and language and area and continent, and those all add up to the whole. So it's a bit misleading in that respect. This one is using a map of a wing to illustrate the different types of feathers and how they can show up on different wings. So very effective illustration here. Color coding to show how the different feather types translate from wing shape to wing shape, and with the names down below there. And also a nice description of how those different wing shapes are used. Another great example of a map is showing the watersheds across the country. So you can see where those river basins all come from. Here's another one that's not necessarily mathy, but sciencey, kind of like the wing shapes one, where it's showing plant nutrient deficiency. So what do the leaves look like when a plant is missing certain elements? Here's another example of a network graph that's showing the temperature change and how it's been increasing towards that 1.5 degrees Celsius and that 2 degrees Celsius boundary that we're trying to avoid. You can see that it is getting very close there here in recent years, and this was just 2016. Next, we've got an example of a Venn diagram that shows how the overlapping can work. This is one from an epistemology class that I teach, actually, where you can have truth, you can have belief, and you can have justification, or the reasoning, basically. And there can be overlapping of any of those things, but when all three overlap, then you have knowledge. So you can have something be true with that you believe without justification, in the overlapping blue and yellow. In the orange section, you can see that you have justified belief, but so you can have reasoning and you can believe it, but it's actually not true. Or you can have something that is a justified truth that you do not believe in. And when you have knowledge, it's all three of those things. It is true, you do believe it, and you have justification. So that's a nice example of how a Venn diagram can show those overlapping sections. Here's another one, a Japanese concept of ikigai, the intersection of that which you love, that which the world needs, that which you can be paid for, and that which you are good at. And it delineates how those overlap also. Profession, the overlapping of that which you're good at and can be paid for. Vocation, the overlapping of that which you can be paid for and that what the world needs. That which you love and the world needs is your mission, and that which you're good at and you love is your passion. And when you manage to find all of these things in one thing, you've found your ikigai. Timelines are also really helpful for showing change over time, obviously. This is an interesting one, and I've got just a couple of these looking at the populations of generations over time. And so here is projected populations from 2015 to 2050. So it shows you the proportion of the generations alive at any point in time. So you can see the silent generation tailing off here as that older generation passes away, as are the boomers approaching. Their numbers are declining, and as their numbers are declining, Gen X is kind of hitting their prime, and at some point around 2028, predicted by this graph, Gen X will actually exceed the boomer population. And you can see over here on the left at the very top in 2015, the millennials already exceeded the baby boomers as proportion of society. So currently and for the foreseeable future, it does not factor in Generation Y. So it would be interesting to see where they fall here. But the millennials will be the largest population in the US. And this next one is showing where Gen Z fits in. This was one from 2014, and it's showing the population in these different age groups. So the greatest generation in 2014 were basically the late 80s, early 90s. The silent generation are the basically 70s and early 80s. The baby boomers were in their 50s and 60s. And Gen X is in their mid 30s to 40s. And the millennials were 16 to early 30s, and Gen Z was up to age 16. And you can see they say the percentage of population. So there were 22% of the population in 2014. The Gen Z was compared to 23% of the millennials. And the numbers are, while declining slightly for each year, are not declining that much. So it would be interesting to see more recent data and how those percentages are shifting and where they will decide to cut off Generation Z. Generation X is 21% of the population, baby boomers are 24%, silent generation 9%, and the greatest generation 1%. So this is another way to represent a timeline. It's a timeline of age across the bottom. Another way to represent a timeline is that cyclical manner. Planetary motions is one that you can illustrate that way. The red line here is Mars, and where that line starts is where Mars begins its track at the beginning of 2019, and where it ends with the little Mars glyph is where it ends. So those are all the signs that it goes through over the course of 2019. These purple and green planets up towards the top, they have shorter tracks that are a little zigzaggy, so those are outer planets. They travel not as far and go into retrograde more often. So this is just another way to represent timelines. This one shows marketing budget. This is from The Functional Art by Albert Cairo, a book that is an optional read. If you're really digging these subjects and want to get in a little bit more, that's one where you can find out some more. Here the timeline is over on the right-hand side and broken down by months. And what it's doing, it's taking the budget for a year on the left-hand side, breaking it down into different categories, and then you can see how those categories are unequally distributed across months of the year. So direct marketing is primarily at the beginning here. Trade events and trade shows are pretty well distributed with a higher proportion in January and February. Mobile, online, and web marketing, pretty evenly distributed, as it is for advertising and public relations. But this can show kind of that direct marketing really just occurs at the beginning of the year. We've got a few more that are kind of just interesting tidbits. So this one's showing if one seed comes out from the middle, grows out from the middle of a plant seed head, and then the next seed grows out at 137 degrees. 137.05 degrees is the golden angle. That's the middle one there. So you get this nice even distribution. If you change it just 1 degree up or 1 degree down, you can see how drastically it changes the distribution of those seeds, and you start getting gaps. No longer are they nice and evenly distributed. So it's showing the power of the golden angle for creating these beautiful spiral distribution patterns. Another really pretty one here is showing the angles that are coming out from the water lily, the 16-fold circle of the water lily, and the underlying geometric patterning that can go behind it. Here's another one that's showing underlying geometric patterning in those spiral patternings in the peacock feather spots. And another one, sentence diagramming, is another great example of a way to use an infographic to visually understand something that might be hard to grasp purely conceptually. All right, that is all I've got for this one. I hope you enjoyed it and got some good ideas. Um, enjoy your reading this week and look forward to our discussions.